The roads were nearly invisible beneath the thick sheet of ice and falling snow. I had been driving for hours, my fingers stiff against the wheel, as my car heater struggled to keep up with the bitter cold. The blizzard had come in faster than the forecast predicted, and now I was stuck in it. The road ahead swallowed by an endless swirl of white. The silence of a snowstorm is different from any other kind. It's thick, pressing in on you from every side, muting the world until all that exists is the hum of your engine and the occasional groan of wind against the glass. I kept my eyes fixed on the road, my wipers barely keeping up with the flurries. That was when I saw the figure standing at the edge of the road. At first, I thought it was a trick of the snowfall, just a dark shape shifting the storm. But as I got closer, I realized it was a person, wrapped tightly in an old-fashioned overcoat, their face obscured by a hood. I slowed down, pulling over next to them. No one should have been out in weather like this. I rolled down the window slightly. "Hey, you need a ride?" There was no response. The figure stood completely still, head slightly bowed, as if they hadn't even heard me. The snow swirled around them, sticking to their coat and forming little icicles on the fabric. I glanced around, but there were no other cars, no footprints leading to or away from where they stood. I hesitated before unlocking the passenger. "It's freezing. Get in." Without a word, the figure stepped forward and slid into the seat. As they shut the door, the temperature inside the car dropped so suddenly that I gasped, my breath misting in front of me. It felt like all the warmth had been sucked out in an instant. I cranked up the heat. "Where are you headed?" Silence. The passenger sat perfectly still, face turned slightly toward the window. Their hood was deep, casting shadows over their face, but I could just make out the pale, almost bluish skin underneath. Something about the way they were sitting, rigid, hands folded in their lap, unsettled me. I cleared my throat. "Storm's pretty bad, huh?" "Nothing." I forced out a small chuckle. "Well, don't worry, I'll get us to town soon." As I drove, I kept stealing glances at my passenger. They hadn't moved at all, not even to adjust their seatbelt or shift their hands. And then I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. No breath misted from their lips. I turned my focus back to the road, suddenly aware of how quiet the car had become. Even the hum of the heater seemed distant. I told myself I was imagining things, that the cold was just playing tricks on me. A few miles passed in silence before I saw the sign for a gas station up ahead. Relieved, I pulled in, stopping beneath the dim overhead lights. "I'm gonna grab some coffee. You want anything?" No response. I turned my head slightly, trying not to make it obvious that I was watching them. They hadn't moved an inch. Slowly, I opened my door, stepping out into the freezing night. The moment I did, I felt a wave of warmth against my skin, like stepping out of a freezer. The temperature had only dropped inside the car. I slammed the door and took a step back, heart pounding. Through the frost-covered window, I could still see the figure sitting there, unmoving. My breath came in short, panicked puffs. I reached for my phone to call someone. Who? I wasn't sure. But just as my fingers brushed my pocket, I made the mistake of looking away. In that brief second, the car's interior light flickered, and when I looked back, the passenger seat was empty. The door had never opened. There were no footprints in the fresh snow outside. The only sign that anything had been there at all was a thick layer of frost on the passenger, an imprint of where someone or something had been sitting. I didn't go inside the gas station. I didn't even think. I just got back in the car, turned on the heat full blast, and drove. The seat beside me remained empty, but the cold lingered for miles, long after I'd left that road behind. Later that night, I looked up local stories about that stretch of highway. What I found still haunts me. Decades ago, a woman had been stranded during a blizzard on that very road. She had been picked up by a driver who swore she had disappeared from his car before reaching town. Days later, they found her body in a snowdrift, frozen solid, wearing the exact same old-fashioned coat. And every few years, when the snowstorms hit, drivers still report seeing someone standing by the roadside, waiting. The snowstorm had been raging for hours by the time I reached the cabin. It stood alone at the edge of the forest, half buried in drifts of white, its roof sagging under the weight of fresh snow. My grandfather built this place decades ago, and after he passed, it had been left abandoned, visited only occasionally. But with the storm coming in faster than expected, I had no choice but to take shelter here for them. The air inside was stale, the kind of cold that seeps into the walls and refuses to leave. I started a fire in the old stone fireplace, watching the flames flicker as I settled onto the couch with a heavy blanket. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, rattling the windows and sending bursts of powdery snow against the glass. Then I saw him. At first, I thought my tired eyes were playing tricks on me, but as I leaned forward, peering through the frost-covered window, I realized it wasn't my imagination. A man stood at the edge of the motionless, barely visible in the swirling white. He was just standing there, staring at the cabin. I swallowed, unease creeping over me. Who the hell would be out in a blizzard like this? The nearest town was miles away and the roads were nearly impassable. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it through the window, but the light barely cut through the heavy snowfall. "Hey," I called, my voice barely carrying over the wind. "Do you need help?" The figure didn't move. He was standing at the exact same distance, the same posture, staring at the cabin. A deep chill ran through me, colder than the winter air. Something about his stillness made my skin crawl. No one stood that still. Not in this kind of cold, not in this kind of storm. I turned away from the window, forcing a laugh. "You're just exhausted," I muttered to myself. "You're seeing things." But when I turned back, my breath caught in my throat. The man was closer, not by much, maybe only a few steps, but he hadn't moved. I hadn't looked away for more than a second, and yet he was closer. A tightness settled in my chest. I grabbed my phone, my fingers numb as I checked for a signal. Nothing. No bars, no Wi-Fi. Just the useless battery icon blinking in the dim light of the cabin. I turned back to the window, my hands shaking. He was closer again. I stumbled back, my heart slamming against my ribs. He was halfway across the yard now, his dark figure barely distinguishable in the storm. And still, he wasn't moving. I squeezed my eyes shut, my breath coming in quick, panicked bursts. This wasn't happening. It wasn't real. I was tired. I was seeing things. When I opened my eyes, he was standing right outside the window. A strangled gasp escaped my throat. The glass fogged with my breath as I stared at him, frozen in place. His face was obscured by the dark hood of his coat, his hands hanging limply at his sides. I backed away from the window, my foot catching on the rug as I nearly tripped. My mind raced. I had to do something. I couldn't just stand here. The door. I turned and sprinted for the cabin door, shoving the deadbolt into place with trembling fingers. My breath came in shallow gasps as I pressed my back against the wooden frame, trying to convince myself I was safe. The cabin was locked. The windows were shut. Then I heard it. A single knock. Not a pounding. Not a frantic banging of someone desperate to come in from the cold. Just one soft knock. Deliberate. I held my breath, my pulse thundering in my ears. Another knock. I turned slowly, dread pooling in my stomach. The window was completely fogged over now, the firelight flickering weakly in the cabin's dim interior. A third knock. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then the whisper came, not from outside, from behind me. I spun, my body colliding with the wall as my eyes darted around the cabin. The room was empty. The door was still locked. But the whisper, it had been right next to my ear. A cold realization settled over me, like a death shroud. The man had never been outside. He had been inside the whole time. The fire guttered, casting long shadows along the walls. My breath came in rapid gasps as I backed toward the door, my fingers fumbling to undo the lock. The air around me was thick, suffocating, pressing against my skin like unseen hands. And then, just as I yanked the door open and stumbled out into the snow, the whispers stopped. The wind roared to life again, the cold biting into my skin as I ran. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I reached my truck, barely managing to start the frozen engine with shaking hands. As I sped away, my headlights cast one last beam over the cabin, and there, standing in the doorway, was the man, still silent, watching. The blizzard had come out of nowhere, turning the quiet roads into a maze of white nothingness. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles aching from the cold. The highway had vanished beneath thick layers of snow, and even with my high beams on, I could barely see beyond a few feet. The world outside my car had become an endless void of swirling frost. I had been driving for hours, trying to get home before the storm worsened, but I had miscalculated. The snow was relentless, falling in thick, blinding sheets, and my gas gauge was dipping dangerously close to empty. I needed to find shelter, fast. That was when I saw the motel sign flickering through the storm. It was old, the neon buzzing weakly in the wind, half the letters burnt out. Pine Hollow Inn. I didn't remember seeing it on the map, but in my desperation, I didn't care. I pulled into the nearly abandoned parking lot, the snow already piling up against the doors of the building. There were only a few cars outside, their windshields completely iced over, as if they had been sitting there for a long time. I hurried inside, my boots crunching against the frozen ground. The moment I stepped into the lobby, I was hit with a wave of warmth and the scent of something faintly sweet, almost like decaying fruit. The place was old, the carpet worn down, the walls covered in faded floral wallpaper. A single lamp flickered on the front desk, casting eerie shadows across the room. Behind the counter stood a man. He was tall and thin, his face unnervingly long, his skin stretched tight over sharp cheekbones. His eyes were small, too small for his face, and they didn't blink as he watched me approach. "Looking for a room?" His voice was smooth, almost too polite, like a radio announcer from an old recording. I nodded, shivering as I rubbed my hands together. "Yeah, just for the night. The storm's bad." He didn't respond right away. He just stared at me, as if deciding something. Then, with slow, deliberate movements, he pulled an old-fashioned key from behind the counter and slid it toward me. Room 107, last one on the left. I grabbed the key, noticing how cold it felt in my hand. Thanks. Do you have Wi-Fi or cell service? The man's lips curled into something that might have been a smile. No service out here, just rest. You'll be safe inside. Something about the way he said it sent a shiver down my spine. I forced a tight smile and headed toward my room. The hallway was dimly lit, the lights above me flickering as I walked. The carpet was damp, the air heavy with something stale, like mildew that had settled into the walls. The doors were old, their numbers barely hanging onto rusted plaques. I passed room 101, then 102. As I walked, I noticed something strange. Every door had deep scratches near the doorknob, as if something had clawed at them. I swallowed hard, trying to ignore it as I reached room 107. The key turned with an unsettling click, and the door creaked open into darkness. The room was strange. The bed was neatly made, but the air smelled like dust and something faintly metallic. The lamp beside the bed cast a dull, yellowish glow, just bright enough to reveal the old wallpaper peeling at the corners. The window was covered by thick curtains, but something told me not to look outside. I dropped my bag and sat on the bed, trying to shake the unease curling in my stomach. The wind howled outside, making the walls creak as if the building were breathing. I told myself I was being paranoid. It was just an old motel, nothing more. Then, the phone rang. The sharp sound made me jump. I hadn't even noticed the old rotary phone sitting on the nightstand. Slowly, I reached for it, my fingers trembling as I lifted it to my ear. For a moment, there was nothing but static. Then, you need to now. The voice was a whisper, urgent and terrified. It sounded like a woman, her breath ragged, as if she had been running. I shot up from the bed, my pulse hammering in my ears. Who is this? The line went dead. A heavy silence settled over the room. My breath came in quick, uneven gasps as I slowly lowered the phone back onto the room. My body screamed at me to leave, to get in my car and drive. Storm beat. But then, a soft scratching was coming from the closet. I turned slowly, my heart pounding. The closet door was slightly ajar, the darkness inside feeling deeper than it should have been. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, as if something inside was trying to get out. I took a shaky step forward, my entire body tense. With one trembling hand, I reached out and grabbed the handle. I hesitated. Then, in one swift motion, I yanked the door open. Nothing. The closet was empty. Just a dark, musty space with an old wooden hanger swinging slightly from where I had disturbed it. My breath came out in a shaky laugh. Jesus, I'm losing it. I shut the closet door and turned back toward the bed. And that was when I saw it. The reflection in the mirror. There was something standing behind me. It was tall. Too tall. Its body was thin, almost stretched. Its limbs too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. I couldn't see its face. Just the vague, shifting outline of something wrong. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. Nothing. The room was empty. But when I turned back to the mirror, the reflection was still there, watching me. A choked scream clawed its way up my throat as I stumbled backward, slamming against the door. My fingers fumbled for the handle, but it wouldn't turn. It was locked. The reflection moved, but I didn't. My entire body went numb as the thing in the mirror lifted its hand, pressing its long fingers against the glass. The mirror rippled, as if it were made of water. Then, in a voice that wasn't mine, it whispered, "You shouldn't have come here." The lights flickered. The air turned ice cold. The last thing I saw before everything went dark was my own reflection, smiling at me with a mouth that wasn't mine. And then I was pulled inside. The snowstorm swallowed the road in a suffocating white abyss. My tires skidded against the ice as I squinted through the windshield, desperately searching for any sign of civilization. My GPS had died an hour ago. My phone had no signal, and the fuel gauge was dipping dangerously close to empty. I had no choice but to keep driving, hoping I'd find shelter before the blizzard completely buried me. Then I saw it. A house. It stood alone, at the end of a long, unmarked driveway, its windows dark, its frame barely visible through the sheets of falling snow. There was no sign of life, no tire tracks, no footprints. But at that moment, it didn't matter. If I didn't get out of the storm soon, I was going to freeze to death. I pulled into the driveway, my headlights cutting through the darkness. The house looked ancient, the wooden siding weathered and cracked. The porch sagged slightly, the front door slightly ajar as if waiting for me. My gut twisted. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around. But what choice did I have? I stepped out of the car, the wind immediately tearing through my coat. Snowflakes stung my skin like tiny needles as I hurried up the steps and pushed open the door. Inside, the air was still, heavy. It was warmer than I expected, though there was no sign of a heater or a fireplace. The furniture was old, covered in dust, as if no one had lived here in decades. A grandfather clock stood in the corner, its hands frozen at exactly 3:12. I called out, my voice swallowed by the silence. Hello? Is anyone here? No answer. I hesitated, debating whether to stay or go, but the howling wind outside made the decision for me. I closed the door behind me, wiping the snow from my jacket as I stepped further inside. The floorboards groaned beneath my weight, the sound echoing through the empty house. That was when I noticed the footprints. They were faint but unmistakable, tracks in the dust leading down the hallway and disappearing into a doorway on the left. My breath caught in my throat. Someone had been here. Recently. I followed them, my heart pounding. The footprints stopped just outside a door that was slightly ajar. A dim, flickering light spilled out from within. I pushed the door open. It was a bedroom. A single candle burned on the nightstand, its wax dripping on. The bed was neatly made, the sheets impossibly clean compared to the rest of the decaying house. And on the pillow, a note. I stepped closer, my pulse hammering in my ears. The paper was yellowed, the handwriting scrawled in frantic, uneven strokes. If you find this, you need to leave. Now, do not stay past 3:12. The grandfather clock's frozen hands flashed in my mind. 3:12. I swallowed hard, a cold sweat breaking out on my skin. I reached for my phone, but as expected, there was still no signal. My fingers trembled as I backed toward the door, ready to bolt. Then I heard it, a slow, deliberate creak from the hallway. Someone was out there. I held my breath, listening. The creaking continued, growing closer, until it stopped just outside the bedroom door. A shadow fell across the floor. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The air in the room thickened, pressing down on me like invisible hands. Then, a whisper, low, hollow, right on the other side of the door. You shouldn't be here! The candle flickered violently. A rush of cold air swept through the room, slamming the door shut. I ran. I didn't care what was in the hallway, didn't care if I had to crash through a window to get out. I just ran. But the house had changed. The hallway was longer. The front door was gone. The walls seemed to breathe, the wallpaper shifting like something was moving beneath it. My own footsteps echoed unnaturally, as if something was following right behind me just out of sight. I turned a corner and froze. The grandfather clock was, but now, the hands had 3:13. A wave of nausea washed over me as the air turned heavy, suffocating. The walls pulsed, the shadows stretching unnaturally. My legs felt like lead, my body screaming at me to move, to run. Then, from the darkness, hands, pale, withered hands, reaching out from the walls, from the floor, from the ceiling, grabbing, clawing, dragging. I screamed. I don't remember running down the steps, stumbling through the snow. The next thing I knew, I was in my car, my fingers fumbling to turn the key in the ignition. The headlights flickered on, illuminating the house one last time. And in the window, staring back at me, was myself. My own face, twisted in a silent scream, trapped behind the glass. Then the lights inside the house went out, and I drove, faster than I ever had in my life, not stopping, not looking back until the storm finally cleared. When I checked my phone hours later, there was service again. I tried searching for Pine Hollow House. It didn't exist. There was no house, no road, no record of anything ever being there. But when I looked down at my jacket, my breath hitched in my throat, because clutched in my shaking hand was the snowstorm had turned everything into a blank, endless void. I had been driving for hours, the roads barely visible beneath the thick layer of ice and slush. My gas tank was nearly empty, and there wasn't a single road sign in sight. I should have never taken this shortcut. Just as panic started creeping in, I spotted a house in the distance. It was old, but sturdy looking, its porch light flickering against the whirling snow. I hesitated. Stopping at a stranger's house in the middle of nowhere didn't sit right with me. But my options were limited. Either I froze in my car or took my chances with whoever lived inside. I pulled into the driveway, the crunch of snow beneath my tires the only sound. As I stepped out, the cold hit me like a sledgehammer. My boots sank into the deep snow as I hurried to the front door and knocked. Silence. I knocked again, harder this time. The door creaked open on its own. I stood there, heart hammering. Hello? No answer. The inside was dimly lit, a fire crackling in the living room. The place looked abandoned, yet lived in. A plate of half-eaten food sat on the coffee table. A chair was slightly pulled out. A coat hung near the door, damp as if someone had just come inside. Hello? I called again, stepping inside. The warmth of the house was a welcome relief, but the air felt wrong, thick, heavy, like the walls were holding their breath. I glanced around, searching for any sign of the owner. Then, I saw the photos on the fireplace mantel. They were all the same man, a middle-aged guy with graying hair, always posing stiffly in front of the house. In one, he stood beside a snowman. In another, he was shoveling the driveway. The most recent photo caught my eye. The same man, standing on the front porch. But something about it made my stomach churn. His expression was different his mouth slightly open, his eyes wide, like he had just seen something. like he had just noticed the photographer. A loud thump came from upstairs. I froze. Someone was. Slowly, I turned toward the staircase. The upper floor was dark, but I could hear movement. Slow, deliberate footsteps. A voice, low and hoarse, called out, "Who's there?" I swallowed hard. I'm sorry. My car almost ran out of gas. I just needed shelter. Silence. Then footsteps. Fast, heavy. Moving toward me. I bolted. I didn't care about the cold anymore. I needed to get back to my car. But as I reached the front door, something grabbed my wrist. I screamed, yanking free, stumbling back. No one was there, but the pressure of fingers still lingered on my skin. The air shifted. The fire in the living room flickered violently before going out. Then, the photos. They had changed. The man in the pictures was gone. Every single frame was now just the house, empty, as if he had stepped out. The floor creaked behind me. I spun around. A figure stood at the bottom of the staircase, tall, motionless. His face was blurry, shifting, wrong. His mouth opened, wider than any human should be able to, and then, in a voice that sounded like my own, he whispered, "You shouldn't have come here." The lights went out, and the last thing I felt was breath on the back of my neck. The snowstorm had swallowed the road, turning the world into a swirling, endless white. My headlights barely cut through the blizzard, and the farther I drove, the more lost I felt. The highway had vanished behind me, replaced by winding back roads that seemed to lead nowhere. I was alone, or at least I thought I was. Then I saw it, a gas station in the middle of nowhere. The neon sign buzzed weakly against the howling wind, its red glow barely visible through the thick snowfall. The place looked old, forgotten. A single pump stood outside, half buried in ice, and beyond it, a small convenience store with fogged-up windows. I didn't have a choice. My gas tank was nearly empty, and my phone had no signal. I pulled up to the pump, stepping out into the freezing wind. The air was unnaturally still, as if the storm had quieted just for me. There was no one else around, no other cars, just the soft crunch of my boots in the snow. I tried the pump. Nothing. Frustrated, I headed inside. A dull bell jingled. I pushed open the door, and warm, stale air rushed over me. The store was empty. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with expired snacks and dust-covered bottles of soda. A small TV in the corner flickered static, though there was no one watching. At the front, an old register sat untouched, and behind it, a man. He stood motionless, staring at me with glassy, unfocused eyes. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his clothes looked decades old. Hey, I said, shivering. "The pump isn't working." The man didn't respond. He just stood there, watching. I took a cautious step closer. "Do you work here?" A long pause. Then, finally, in a voice too hollow, too empty, he muttered, "No one leaves after midnight." My stomach twisted. "What?" The man blinked, as if waking from a trance. His expression changed, his mouth twitching into something like a forced smile. "Sorry," he said, his voice suddenly normal. "Pump should be working now." Every instinct in my body told me to run. Instead, I nodded slowly and backed toward the door. The man didn't move, didn't blink as I turned away. The moment I stepped outside, I felt it. Something was watching me. The storm had grown quieter, but the air was heavier now, pressing against me like an unseen force. The gas pump was running, the numbers ticking upward on the screen, but I barely noticed. Because across the lot, just beyond the edge of the neon light, there was someone standing in the snow, a dark shape, motionless, half hidden by the storm. I couldn't see their face. I couldn't even tell if they were real. The moment I noticed them, they moved. A slow, staggering step forward, then another. I dropped the pump and ran to my car, my breath coming in short, panicked gasp. I fumbled with my keys, my hands numb, the figure growing closer with every heartbeat. I slammed the door shut, locking it just as my headlights flickered on, and the figure was gone. I scanned the lot, my pulse hammering, but there was nothing there. No footprints, no sign that anyone had ever been there at all. Then, from inside the store, the old man was still standing behind the counter, but now he wasn't alone. He was smiling, and standing behind him, just barely visible through the glass, was the figure, staring, grinning, mouthing two words, "Drive fast." I didn't question it. I hit the gas, my tires skidding on the ice as I tore out of the lot. I didn't stop, didn't look back, even as the storm swallowed the gas station behind me. But as I drove, my rearview mirror flickered. For just a second, I saw something in the back seat, a shape, a face, that same twisted grin, then nothing, just my own reflection staring back at me. The snowstorm had turned the road into a death trap. My tires skidded across the ice, my headlights barely illuminating the blinding white that stretched endlessly in every direction. I had no idea where I was, no GPS signal, no road signs, just an old, winding highway that seemed to lead deeper into nowhere. I'd been driving for hours when I saw it, a motel. Its neon sign flickered weakly in the storm. Vacancy. I pulled into the lot, my car struggling against the thick snow. The building was small, rundown, the kind of place you only stop at when you have no other choice. But I was exhausted, freezing, and the thought of spending another hour in my car was unbearable. The lobby was eerily silent when I stepped inside. A dusty chandelier swayed slightly overhead, as if disturbed by an unseen breeze. The walls were lined with faded floral wallpaper, peeling at the edges. Behind the front desk sat an old woman, her thin lips stretched into a forced smile. "You must be freezing," she said, her voice slow and deliberate. "A storm like this? You'll need to stay the night." Something about the way she said it sent a shiver through me. "Yeah, I guess so," I muttered, glancing around. "Just need a room for the night." Her smile widened as she slid a key across the counter. "Room 7, down the hall, last door on the right." I took the key, hesitating for a second before nodding and making my way toward the hallway. The place smelled of dust and something else, something faintly metallic. As I reached my room, I noticed the door next to mine was slightly open, just a crack, and from inside, a single eye watched me. I froze. The eye didn't blink, didn't move, just stared. I rushed into my room, locking the door behind me. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed away, staring at the door, half expecting it to creak open. But nothing happened. The room was cold, colder than it should have been. The heater hummed softly, but the air felt frigid, heavy. The bed was neatly made, the lamps dimly lit, but something about the place felt wrong. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just tired, imagining. I crawled into bed, pulling the covers tight around me. But then, a knock, software deliberate, right outside my door. I held my breath. Another knock. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to stay still. Maybe it was the old woman. Maybe she had forgotten something. But then I heard it. A whisper, right at the door. "He's in there." Every muscle in my body locked up. The voice was low, rasping, almost hungry. A second voice, softer this time, replied, "I know." I scrambled out of bed, grabbing my phone. No signal. My hands were shaking as I backed away from the door. Then, the doorknob turned, slowly, deliberately. I grabbed the chair from the corner of the room and shoved it under the handle. The knob rattled harder now, as if someone or something was testing it. And then, silence. The air felt heavier, colder. I stayed frozen, my breath coming in short gasps, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Minutes passed. Then, just as I started to think it was over, a soft scratching sound came from the other side of the door. Fingernail, dragging. I couldn't breathe. I stood there paralyzed as the scratching slowly moved downward until it reached the floor. Then, a whisper, right at the bottom of it. "We see you." I didn't sleep that. I stayed in the corner of the room, clutching my phone, waiting for. When the first light of dawn crept through the curtains, I cautiously moved unlocked. The chair was, and when I finally worked up the courage to step outside, the hallway was empty. No footprints in the dust. No sign that anyone had been there at all. I didn't bother checking. I ran straight to my car, shoving the key into the ignition with trembling hands. As I pulled out of the lot, I glanced at the motel one last time, and in the window of room 6, where that eye had watched me the night before, the curtain shifted. Someone was still watching, and as I sped away, disappearing into the storm, I swore I heard a whisper in the wind, "Come back soon." The snowstorm had been relentless for hours, burying everything in a thick, suffocating blanket of white. The roads had long since disappeared, and I could barely see beyond my own headlights. My gas tank was dangerously low, my phone had no signal, and the realization was sinking in. I was completely alone in the middle of nowhere, or so I thought. Then, through the blur of falling snow, I saw something. A house. It sat at the end of a long, winding driveway, barely visible against the storm. It looked old, almost abandoned, but the porch light was on. I had no choice. I pulled in, my tires crunching against the ice. The house was a 2-story Victorian, its once grand exterior now weathered and peeling. I hesitated before stepping out of the car, a strange unease settling in my stomach. But the cold was unbearable and I needed shelter. The front door opened before I even knocked. A man stood in the doorway, tall and thin, his face eerily expressionless. "You must be freezing." His voice was deep, slow. "Come inside." Something about him made me hesitate. His skin was pale, too pale, like he hadn't been outside in years. His eyes, deep-set and dark, watched me with an unsettling intensity. Still, the storm raged on behind me, and I had nowhere else to go. Inside, the house was warm. The fire in the living room crackled softly, casting long shadows across the walls. The place was old but well kept, furnished with antique chairs, bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes, paintings of people whose eyes seemed to follow me wherever I moved. "Thank you," I said, rubbing my hands together. "I really appreciate this. My car was running out of gas." "You shouldn't be here," the man interrupted. I froze. His expression hadn't changed, but there was something new in his voice, a warning. I'm sorry? His gaze flickered to the clock on the wall. It's almost midnight, he murmured. If you stay, you must promise. Do not open any doors. No matter what you hear. A chill ran through me, and it had nothing to do with the storm outside. What do you mean? I asked, forcing a nervous laugh. What happens at midnight? The man didn't answer. Instead, he turned abruptly and disappeared into the hallway, leaving me alone in the dimly lit room. I sat by the fire, trying to shake the unease creeping up my spine. The house was silent, save for the occasional crackle of the flames. The wind outside howled against the windows, and for a while, I told myself everything was fine. Then, at exactly midnight, I heard it. A knock, software slow, coming from the hallway. My heart pounded. I remembered the man's warning. Don't open it. I sat frozen, barely breathing. The knock came again, then another, and another. It wasn't coming from the front door. It was coming from inside the house. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing it to stop. But then, the whispers began. Low, raspy voices, murmuring just beyond the hallway. I couldn't make out the words, but they were getting closer. Then, a click. One of the doors down the hallway unlocked. I gripped the arms of the chair, every muscle in my body tense. The whispers grew louder. Then footsteps, slow, uneven, coming toward me. I turned toward the hallway just in time to see a shadow move. Not walk, not step. Glide. It stopped just before the edge of the light. I could see it now. A shape, tall, twisted, wrong. Its head tilted slowly, as if studying me. Then, in a voice that sounded like 100 voices speaking at once, it whispered, "You opened the door." I hadn't. But when I looked back, the hallway door was open. I don't remember running. I don't remember grabbing my keys or bursting through the front door into the freezing storm. But I do remember the man's face as I passed him. He was standing at the bottom of the watching, expression. And as I ran to my car, I could still hear the whisper following me to the night. I didn't stop driving until the house was nothing but a speck, and even now I still dream of that hallway. Still hear the whisper, and sometimes in the dead of night. I wake up to the sound of a soft knock on my bedroom door. The snowstorm came out of nowhere, swallowing the road in a whirlwind of white. One minute, I was cruising down the highway, my gas tank just below half. The next, my car was barely crawling forward, tires slipping on unseen ice beneath the snow. My headlights were useless against the storm, and soon, I couldn't tell if I was still on the road at all. Then, through the blinding snowfall, I saw a gas station. It stood alone on the side of the road, an old, forgotten relic with a single rusted pump. The lights inside flickered weakly, and an open sign buzzed in the window. I had no choice. I pulled in, relieved to see a dim glow coming from inside the station. The place looked deserted, but the lights were on, and that was enough for me. As I stepped out, the wind howled, carrying an unnatural chill. I hurried inside, slamming the door behind me. The bell overhead gave a weak chime. The station was small. Dusty shelves lined the walls, stocked with faded snack bags and expired canned food. A single register sat on the counter, and behind it, an old man stared at me. His skin was pale, almost gray, and he didn't blink. "Cold night," he muttered. His voice was flat, like it had been drained of emotion. "Yeah," I said, forcing a chuckle. "Hell of a storm out there." He nodded, his gaze never leaving me. I cleared my throat, trying to shake the growing unease. "Do you have gas?" The old man's lips parted. For a second, I thought he was about to say something, but instead, he smiled. His teeth were wrong. Too sharp. Too many. "Pumps outside," he finally said, "and cash only." I hesitated. Okay. Do you have a bathroom?" He pointed to a door at the back of the store. I nodded and walked past him, but as I did, I swore I heard him whisper something. It almost sounded like, "Too late." The bathroom was small and disgusting. Grime-covered sink, a single flickering light. I shut the door, trying to ignore the pit forming in my stomach. Something about this place felt off. Then, as I washed my hands, I noticed something. A mirror hung on the wall beside me, not over the sink, just there, in the corner. It was cracked, the glass warped, but as I stared into it, I saw something, a reflection, but not mine. A man stood behind me, tall, skin stretched too tight over his skull, eyes black as the void, and he was smiling. I spun around. Nothing. The bathroom was empty, but in the mirror, he was still there. His mouth began to move, but no sound came. His grin stretched wider, too wide. Then, the lights went out. The room plunged into darkness, and I heard whispers, not from the mirror, from behind me. I bolted out of the bathroom, nearly colliding with the old man at the register. His head tilted slightly, like he'd been expecting me to run. "You saw it," he murmured. My breath came in ragged gasps. "What the hell is this?" The old man just smiled. "Get your gas and leave before it follows you." I didn't ask questions. I ran outside, barely noticing that the storm had stopped. The world was eerily silent. I pumped my gas as fast as I could, glancing around, feeling that same sickening, watchful presence from the bathroom. Then, as I turned toward the store one last time, the lights inside went out. The old man was gone, and in the darkness, I saw something move behind the glass. Something tall, waiting. I didn't stick around. I got in my car and sped off, tires skidding against the icy road. The gas station disappeared behind me, swallowed by the night. I thought I was safe, until I checked my rearview mirror and saw a reflection that wasn't mine.